This time on Poll Hub, to quote a member of Lee's favorite team, it's deja vu all over again at the U.S.-Mexican border. Joe Biden, like Donald Trump and Barack Obama before him, is facing a crisis at the southern border as a flood of unaccompanied minors cross into the U.S. seeking asylum. What are the chances Biden can find a way to fix this problem and even bigger immigration issues? We will take a look. Then, Biden the uniter? Americans aren't so sure, but are we conflating unity with bipartisanship? We're going to talk about that. And finally, Lee's fun fact. It's all about questions pollsters used to ask about and of women. This should be interesting. Let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Mary Griffith, Director of Media Initiatives at the Marist Poll, sitting in for Barbara Carvalho today.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion, sitting in for myself.
The border we have, when I said deja vu all over again at the top, this is an issue. The crisis at the border with the kids is in the grand scheme of things, a recent issue. The immigration challenges that presidents face, this goes back to Reagan, and probably before, but Reagan was the first where there's the big deal, made between Democrats and Republicans to kind of solve the immigration problems. And that lasted for a little while. But every president since has dealt with this, and we are right back to where we were with Joe Biden. And Americans, we ask a lot of questions about this. And the one thing I would say is that Americans seem to be as confused as our politics is about immigration and what to do about it. Doesn't seem like Americans have any better solutions than the presidents we elect.
You're absolutely right, Jay. And when we take a look at some of the recent poll numbers, there was a Monmouth University poll that came out at the end of January. And one of the questions that it asked Americans was how important it is for the federal government to address the issue of immigration. And when we take a look at those numbers, 27% said it was extremely important, 44% said it was very important. So that's more than 7 in 10 Americans who feel that it's important for the federal government to take up this issue. At 23% said it's just somewhat important, and only 5% said that it's not important. And when we look at the partisan split here, what's interesting is that there is a little bit of consensus among Democrats and Republicans on this question. 34% of Democrats say that it's extremely important. 43% of Dems, again, say that it's very important. And when we look at Republicans, 29% say it's extremely important and 46% say it's very important. So regardless of party, more than 7 in 10 Americans believe that immigration is something that needs to be handled by the administration and actually the federal government, the larger federal government.
Yeah, and to that point, I think also I saw that Pew Research talking about permanent legal status to immigrants. 54% of Republicans also favor that. So we have a real kind of conundrum here on both the Democrat and Republicans, not surprisingly, at seeing the situation totally differently, and no one can decide whether the cart goes first or the horse goes first. The Republicans want to see the influx stopped and that U.S. laws are followed. And then we can talk about comprehensive immigration reform or what to do about the dreamers or what to do about the children. Democrats want to see a path to citizenship. They want to see a humane and compassionate policy taking care of the kids, reuniting them with their families that were separated during the Trump years. And then if we get people to talk about the notion of what to do with the policies themselves. So let's get citizenship under control. Let's get some of these things, and then we'll bring some kind of reduction in the influx of folks. So we really have a cart and horse problem. And as Jay, you mentioned, and as Mary points out in these figures, this is nothing that's sudden to our political landscape. And we came real close a couple times to getting comprehensive immigration reform. Obviously, it hasn't happened. I think that, interestingly, different media folks have been calling it a very different problem. And, Fox, I saw that since 2014 has been referring to this as a crisis, and it's a drumbeat. And this is, a continuation from build a wall and Mexico will pay for it. And that's, obviously the Trump message. And the Democrats, and other networks, MSNBC, CNN, haven't been mentioning much of this at all until recently. Fox has been calling it a crisis for almost a decade. But their crisis was, we're getting invaded by these immigrants. That was their crisis.
Yeah, and as you both pointed out, this isn't something that's new, but you have to think about it when you think about the Biden administration. Let's put something in perspective here. Last week, and we didn't talk about this, Biden had a huge victory in passing COVID relief and signing that into law. And now we're seeing more and more stories, more and more images coming out about this situation at the border. And Lee, you're 100% right. There's a difference in terms of messaging here. The Biden administration has not called this a crisis at the border, yet other politicians have called it a crisis. The Biden administration is calling it more of a challenge. So is this a nightmare for the Biden administration coming off of a huge legislative victory last week and now having to answer questions about immigration reform and the situation in terms of getting these children placed? We're reaching record levels of migrants coming in at the southern border.
If it is, it's the same problem that every president's faces. This insoluble problem comes along at unfortunate times. One thing we had said earlier, just want to make sure we make it clear that 54% of Republicans favor giving citizenship to the DACA recipients, not all immigrants or illegal immigrants who come into the country. So a distinction there. I think a lot of this, and Mary, you got to this when you talked about his big victory on COVID relief. That was kind of an omnibus thing. There was a lot of stuff stuffed in there. And when we broke it apart, when pollsters broke it apart, not everybody favored every part of it. But as one big thing, especially topped off with $1,400 checks, icing on that cake or candles on the cake or whatever you call it, that was pretty popular. I think what we've seen over the last 2 decades is that comprehensive immigration reform is the opposite of that. Because when we break out the sections, when we ask about DACA, there's an ABC News Ipsos poll back in January. 65% of people support the idea that Joe Biden could take an executive action to reauthorize DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. When you break it down to these specific types of programs, there's way more support for parts of it than when you say comprehensive immigration reform. So I think this is the opposite in some ways of what Biden's victory was just about. And to the extent that they can figure out a way to break this apart, I think that may be the lesson learned over the last 2 decades. We, in fact, have a piece that's going up, in our Facebook feed here in the next week or so about this very question, about where Americans thought Obama was on immigration with this crisis at the border of the children, the unaccompanied children, where Trump and now where Biden is. And the fact is that Americans have never had a particularly high, approval rating of either of the last 2 presidents or so far of this one in their ability to handle immigration, specifically this issue of kids crossing at the border.
Yeah, I want to also comment. I was talking about the media before, and I found it upsetting. There was the time where the kids were put in cages, and the media and the politicians flocked down to Texas and and other places. Like there was nowhere else to go in the world, and there was this avalanche of attention, and the problem didn't go away. The media went away. The kids are still looking there, and to Biden's credit, there has been some reuniting of the children with their parents, but it's becoming a bigger problem because the parents aren't allowed in, but unaccompanied kids are making it in, and then they're going to get eventually into the child welfare system when they get from border security to Homeland Security to Health and Human Services, which just had the Senate confirmation of its secretary, I believe, earlier today. So we haven't even had a secretary of Health and Human Services that ultimately needs to develop the policies. So it's as you both allude to, this has been a decades-long problem, and I sort of agree that it's going to have to be taken in pieces, because efforts, this is not going to be an Obamacare fix where you have a comprehensive healthcare program. This is going to be, let's deal with DACA. Can we get agreement on that? Let's deal with, and I don't think anybody, as we said in the beginning, has a great answer on what to do about this particular aspect of the problem. People are coming in, and building a wall is obviously not a solution in of itself, hasn't been. And I'm not sure the ultimate way of getting around this, other than just try to deal with it in a, kind of like develop places that people can be located, that are ways to bring them into American society.
Before we move on, Mary, just very briefly, I do think it's worth pointing out that judging Biden at this stage, 6 weeks in with this thing just developing, is a little bit unfair. There's been a fair amount of criticism from people who criticize Trump as well, however, on this and not allowing lawyers into certain areas and stuff like that. So I think there's a honeymoon period on this for Joe Biden, but I don't think it's a particularly long honeymoon period with the number of unaccompanied minors crossing the border and what's happening down there. So I think this is not a story that's going to have a long period of time before we get to some really hard questions and tough answers from this administration.
Yeah, I think we're already at the questions part.
Well, it may be too early to judge the president on immigration and immigration reform, but there is one area that Americans are weighing in on, and that is his ability to bring the country closer together and to unify the country. And according to data out of the Pew Research Center, 52% of Americans say they are not at all or not too confident in Biden's ability to bring the country closer together. In fact, Americans divide. 48% are somewhat or very confident in his ability to bring the country closer together. And Jay, you made a really good point in the open. Are we conflating unity with bipartisanship?
I think there's a lot of that going on, and I say that because early on, when in the first couple of days of the Biden administration, there was a lot of talk in the news cycle in various channels about what's he going to do to bring Republicans on. That's bipartisanship. That's not unity. If you can pass a bill that has 75% or 70% of the support of the country, that's much more, that's unity. That's not bipartisanship. That doesn't mean the two are mutually exclusive, but I do think it's important to distinguish between these things. I would love to have, and we get to write our questions, so maybe we can do this. I would love to ask, a question like, do you think anybody could unite the country at this point? And when we ask people, and we do ask them, is it more important for Biden to compromise with Congress and find solutions than stick to his positions? We asked this question just 2 weeks ago. 59% of Democrats and 82% of Republicans believe this. It would be really interesting if we have the time in these polls, to question people for 20 minutes or half an hour. Okay, so let's talk about some issues. Do you think that would you rather have a $400 check or a $1,400 check? Ask specific questions about the specific issues. And I think you'd find pretty quickly that Americans are like, oh, well, yeah, no, I don't really necessarily want them to compromise on that, or vice versa. It can go the other way. I just think that it's very easy to speak in the aggregate about unity. Who's against unity? Nobody. It's like, who's against puppy dogs? But that's not necessarily what the real deal is when you kind of break it apart and ask tough questions about what are you willing to give up for this supposed unity.
Right, and as I was reading through this Pew data, one thing that struck me was, are they not too confident in his ability because of his ability to do so, or is it because of the partisan environment in which we're living in? So let me just take a look at a few more numbers, if I may. And we look at the president's job approval rating this month in March. 54% of Americans approve of the job he's doing. Now let's take a look at how that breaks down among the parties. So it's 86% of Democrats approve, not surprising. 16% of Republicans approve, again, not surprising. But let's take a look at some historical data as well. When we look at the approval ratings of previous presidents with support from the opposing party, we actually see those proportions go down. So Trump had 11% approval rating from Democrats in March 2017. His predecessor, Obama, had a 37% approval rating from Republicans in February of 2009. Bush, 30% from Republicans in February 2001. Clinton also had 30% from Republicans in February of 1993. And George Herbert Walker Bush had a 46% approval rating from Democrats in February of 1989. So as we see those proportions progress throughout previous presidencies, we're seeing what we've seen reflected in our overall political dialogue, which is this partisan split, this partisan rhetoric that we've been discussing almost ad nauseum on the podcast over the past few years.
Yeah. And it goes back to a time, and I believe when Carl Lunsdorf, the venerable political journalist in Washington, still writing a weekly column, when he talked about the notion of our political parties have changed. When we had these coalitional parties where you had liberal and moderate Republicans and moderate and conservative Democrats, not just liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans, you could find in more diverse states, more competitive states, you could find senators who periodically could be broken loose to sort of throw one to the other side. You didn't have this huge blue state, red state divide. Once you get into these, pure parties with the bases that all that counts, then it becomes very difficult to form a coalition, as we're seeing on these bills. We see it in the impeachment bill votes. We see it in the American Rescue Act, the stimulus bill. You don't get anybody from the other side for all intents and purposes. Occasionally a handful, maybe in the House, one or two in the Senate. You just don't. So they become pure. So you're not going to get unity that way. The question is, and I think the Biden administration is trying to redefine unity as getting greater support from the American people, even if it isn't from Congress, because that's not really going to happen. The 70 senators are not going to be jumping on board connected on most issues, or if any issues. So Biden's trying to show, well, like on my handling of the coronavirus, I'm getting Republicans. Some Republicans are, willing to get, the vaccine, not as many as others were hoping. So maybe it becomes a unity issue among the public. I did happen to note that in the Roper Center, the first time they asked the question that had the word bipartisanship in it was in 2000. So after that, it's become like a runaway cart here.
I think that what you talk about, what happens in the Senate versus what happens among the American people, I think that's really the key here. I think political scientists and historians may look back at Joe Biden as the guy, even though he's from the past in a lot of ways, oldest president ever elected, he's the guy who may have cracked the code on figuring out how to kind of de-emphasize and de-escalate, not necessarily what happens in the Senate or the House, not de-escalate the actual action there, but de-escalate the importance of that to the body politic, to the American people, and reassert, kind of part of it is reassert the primacy of the presidency, but also reassert this notion that we are Americans, and so we like this bill, or we like this program, or we're for this, and not really worry about whether there's Republicans or Democrats. If a Republican comes along and does the same thing, it's a little Reagan-esque and a little Clinton-esque in that way, in that it's less about the parties, and it's more about, I feel your pain, that, or it's morning in America. And I think there's a way to look at Biden. It's very early, but there's a way to look at Biden as perhaps in that vein, with that historical context.
Yeah. If you want compromise, as the American people do, but don't elect people who are going to support compromise and vote occasionally for a compromise on a bill, then the candidate, the red Republicans and the blue Democrats keep going on their merry way, and they're thumbing their nose at public opinion on a lot of issues, gun control being one. Maybe the infrastructure issue is one that we can find some unity on. That's a gun like
that's not unity, Lee. That's bipartisanship you're talking about. Don't conflate them.
Yeah, I just broke the conflation rule, the DeDapper conflation rule.
I like that.
So there's more to be said on all these topics, and I'm sure we will as things move along. We did, however, get back into the Roper archives and found, talk about how things change and don't change. Here's one that's interesting. So last week we celebrated, of course, International Women's Day, and it's March. March is Women's History Month, of course. Roper organization in April of 1939. That's even before I was born, Jay. I knew you were going to jump.
I didn't say anything.
Under what circumstances should women work? Now, I know what kind of answer we would get today. Well, let's hear what we got, even the choices that were asked in 1939. The number one answer, almost half of Americans, only if it's necessary or there's no other means of support. Almost half the people. Women's place in the home unless you really got to do it. 14% if they have to support dependents. If there's sickness or death in the family that compels someone to work, 11%. You get the idea. The choice here isn't ever asked about women finding, careers, professionalism, or anything along those lines. It's sort of like, yeah. We have single income families, and we're not going to change that without disrupting the traditional family structure as it was way back when.
It's probably best for me not to comment on this one.
Oh no, I think I want to hear from you, because this also comes from a post from one of our C2C team, our interns, and we'll put a link to this in the show notes. But when you read through that's just one of, I mean, there's one about, do you approve or disapprove of women wearing slacks in public? I mean, what was your reaction, Mary, when you read through those?
I was blown away. I mean, I probably shouldn't have been surprised, but I was, just in terms of the vast number of questions that our students had to choose from, and the nuggets of information that we were able to share with the public. What I will say, though, is it's nice to see that how far women have come over the decades, and it's nice to see that poll question wording reflects that change.
Even includes that option. I mean, it wasn't even a choice at that point. And I am old enough to remember that when I was in college a while back, women could not get credit cards without the permission of their husband.
And maybe we could just leave it right there for this week.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in beautiful Poughkeepsie, New York. I'm Mary Griffith and Poll Hub's executive producer. Thanks so much for joining us today. Rounding out our production team are Casey Schaff, our production supervisor, Amelia Morell, our production assistant, and Marcello Bettman, our trusted editor. Of course, thanks to the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University. They provide us with the ability to look back at survey questions and results over the decades. And if you have questions or comments, reach out to us on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter and Marist Poll on Facebook and Instagram. Finally, if you like what you hear on Poll Hub, please consider leaving us a review on your podcasting app of choice. Positive reviews help others find us. And while you're at it, why not go ahead and subscribe? Again, thanks for being here. We'll catch you next week.